Some wounds never heal, they just learn to hide beneath the surface. After 20 years of mourning her first husband, Sigrid thought she had finally found peace. The aging Norse woman was preparing for her wedding day, a quiet ceremony meant to unite two feuding clans through marriage to a kind widowed chieftain. But when she tried to leave her longhouse that morning, her faithful horse Fjara blocked the door and refused to move. The villagers called it a bad omen. The horse's wild eyes seemed to plead with her, gazing desperately toward the misty forest beyond the village. When Sigrid finally followed her mare into the fog, she discovered something that changed everything. A hidden grave, a buried secret, and the devastating truth about what really happened to her first husband during the war. What had been hidden in those woods for 2 decades that her horse somehow knew. Before we continue this saga, tell us where you're listening from, and if this story stirs your spirit, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow brings something extraordinary. The coastal village of Fjord sat like a weathered jewel between the grey North Sea and the pine-covered hills that rolled inland toward distant mountains. Salt spray carried the eternal conversation between wind and wave, while seabirds wheeled overhead in patterns that seemed to mirror the ancient runes carved into the standing stones that marked the village boundaries. On mornings like this, when the mist hung low over the water and the fishing boats returned with their silver catch, it was easy to believe the old stories about gods walking among mortals. Sigrid Bjornsdottir had lived her entire 45 winters in this place, watching the seasons turn like the pages of a well-worn saga. Her longhouse stood on a gentle rise overlooking the harbour, its timber walls darkened by decades of sea air and smoke from the central hearth. The building had been her father's, and his father's before him, each generation, adding rooms and memories to its sturdy frame. Oak beams held stories in their grain celebrations, sorrows, the everyday moments that make up a life lived fully. This morning should have been the beginning of her second chapter as a wife. The longhouse should have been filled with the bustle of wedding preparations, the scent of honey mead and roasted meat, the laughter of women braiding flowers into her greying auburn hair. Instead, silence hung heavy in the rooms where her war shield still rested against the wall, its oak surface bearing the scratches and dents of battles she had fought when the world seemed simpler, when right and wrong could be settled with steel and courage. 20 years had passed since she last lifted that shield in anger. 20 years since Bjorn Eriksson had kissed her farewell and marched with the other warriors to settle a blood feud that had simmered between their clan and the Ironwood people for 3 generations. He had been 30 winters, then, strong as a bull and twice as stubborn, with hands gentle enough to coax wildflowers from rocky soil and fierce enough to split a man's skull when honor demanded it. "I'll be back before the harvest moon," he had promised, holding her close enough that she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek. "And when I return, we'll expand the horse paddock like you've been wanting. Fjara deserves a proper field for her foals." The harvest moon had come and gone that year, and many more since. Bjorn's body had never been found, lost somewhere in the chaos of the battle at Ravenshollow, his sword arm severed from his body according to the grim reports brought back by the survivors. They said he had died bravely, taking 3 enemies with him before falling. They said his sacrifice had helped turn the tide of battle, ensuring victory for their people. They said many things, these survivors, but none of them could tell her exactly where he had fallen or what had become of his remains. Sigrid had worn widow's black for 2 full years, as tradition demanded. She had tended his memory like a sacred flame, keeping his place at the table, speaking to him each evening as if he might walk through the door at any moment. Gradually, the sharp edge of grief had worn smooth, becoming something she could carry without it cutting her every day. She had found purpose in raising horses, in serving as a wise woman for younger wives facing their own struggles, in the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with dignity and grace. Gunnar Thorfinn had come into her life like spring after a long winter, slowly at first. Then, with gathering warmth, the The chieftain of a neighboring settlement had lost his own wife to fever 3 years past, leaving him to raise their daughter Astrid alone. He was a good man, respected by his people, with silver threading his dark beard and laugh lines carved deep around eyes the color of summer storms. When he had first approached her father's brother about as a possible marriage alliance, Sigrid had been surprised to discover she was not entirely opposed to the idea. "I'm not looking for a young bride to bear me more children," Gunnar had told her during one of their carefully chaperoned walks along the shoreline. "I've had my season of passion and fire. What I seek now is companionship, someone who understands that love can grow in different ways at different times of life." His honesty had touched something in her that she thought had died with Bjorn. Perhaps it was possible to love twice in one lifetime, each love different but equally real. Perhaps a heart could expand rather than simply replace what it had lost. The marriage would also serve practical purposes, uniting their settlements in trade and defense, ensuring that Astrid would have a mother's guidance as she came of age, giving Sigrid the family she had always wanted but never been blessed with during her first marriage. The village elders had been enthusiastic about the match. Eric Magnusson, who had served as spokesman for the settlement since Sigrid's uncle had passed, practically beamed when the arrangements were finalized. "This union will strengthen both our peoples," he had declared at the feast announcing their betrothal. "Peace through marriage has always been the wisest path." Peace, such a simple word for such a complex thing. Sigrid had learned that peace was not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice, trust, and honest dealing between people. True peace required that old wounds be properly healed, not simply covered over and forgotten. And sometimes, she had begun to suspect, the peace they had enjoyed these past 20 years might be built on foundations less solid than they appeared. The horse that stood blocking her door this morning was living proof that some bonds transcended understanding. Fjara had been a yearling when Bjorn left for war, all legs and curiosity, nipping at his cloak as he saddled his stallion for the journey. Now she was 21 winters old, ancient for a horse, her once black coat silvered with age, but her spirit still bright as polished steel. She had never forgotten Bjorn, often lifting her head from grazing to stare toward the forest paths where he used to take her for training rides. More than once over the years, Sigrid had found the mare standing at the edge of the woods, ears pricked forward, as if listening to voices only she could hear. Horses were known to have senses beyond human understanding. They could smell weather changes days in advance, sense the approach of earthquakes, detect illness in their handlers before any symptoms appeared. Old women in the village whispered that horses could see the spirits of the dead, that they served as bridges between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. Sigrid had never put much faith in such tales, but she trusted Fjara's instincts more than she trusted most people. The mare had saved her life more than once during her shield maiden days, sensing ambushes and bad ground before human eyes could detect danger. If Fjara believed something important lay hidden in those mist-shrouded woods, perhaps it was worth investigating, wedding or no wedding. The village was already stirring as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning fog in wisps and tendrils. Smoke rose from cooking fires as women began preparing the feast that would celebrate the union of two households. Children ran between the houses, chasing chickens and getting underfoot while their mothers worked. Fishermen hauled their boats up onto the shingle beach, their catch flashing silver in the growing light. Astrid appeared at the edge of the yard, her 16-year-old face bright with excitement and concern in equal measure. She was a lovely girl, tall for her age, with her father's storm-grey eyes and her mother's golden hair braided with ribbons for the occasion. "Sigrid," she called, lifting her skirts to avoid the morning dew as she hurried forward. "Father sent me to see if you need help with your preparations. The women are asking when you'll be ready for the blessing ceremony." Sigrid looked from the girl to the horse and back again, feeling the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders like a familiar cloak. How could she explain that her wedding day had been derailed by a horse's stubborn refusal to move? How could she admit that part of her was grateful for the delay, that some deep instinct was whispering warnings she couldn't quite name? "There's been a small complication," she said carefully, watching Astrid's face for any sign of judgment or disappointment. "Fjara seems to have other plans for this morning." The girl approached the mare with the easy confidence of someone raised around horses. She stroked the animal's neck, murmuring soft words in the old tongue, but Fjara remained motionless as carved stone. "She's upset about something," Astrid observed, her young voice carrying wisdom beyond her years. "Animals know things we don't always understand. My mother used to say that horses could see the truth of things, even when people tried to hide it." The words sent a chill down Sigrid's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Truth was a precious commodity, she had learned, and not everyone valued it equally. Sometimes the most comfortable lies were the ones people told themselves, and sometimes entire communities could build their peace on foundations that would not bear close examination. "Perhaps," Sigrid said quietly, making a decision that would change everything, "perhaps it's time I listen to what she's trying to tell me." The mist was beginning to lift from the forest, revealing the network of paths that wound between the ancient pines. Somewhere in those woods lay answers to questions she had not known she needed to ask. Somewhere in the shadows cast by trees older than memory, the truth waited like a buried treasure. Her wedding would have to wait. The forest paths, that had once been as familiar as the lines on her own palms, now felt strange beneath Sigrid's feet. 20 years of avoiding these woods had allowed them to reclaim their ancient mystery, branches growing wild across trails she had once known by heart. Fjara moved with purpose ahead of her, no longer the stubborn creature that had blocked her door, but a guide leading her toward something that made the mare's nostrils flare with urgency. Behind them, the village sounds grew fainter, the laughter of children, the calls of women preparing feast tables, the steady rhythm of axes splitting wood for the celebration fires. Each step took Sigrid further from the life she had planned to embrace this day, and deeper into shadows that seemed to hold secrets older than the standing stones that marked their territory. "Wait for me, old friend," Sigrid murmured, gathering her wedding dress to keep it from catching on the thorny undergrowth. The fine wool, dyed the deep blue of summer twilight and embroidered with silver thread, was meant to honor both her station and the solemnity of the marriage ceremony. Now it felt like a costume for a play in which she was no longer certain of her role. Fjara paused at a fork in the path, her head turning first left toward the old hunting grounds, then right toward the sacred grove, where young people went to make their promises to the gods. But then she veered off both paths entirely, picking her way through a tangle of fallen logs and moss-covered stones that Sigrid did not remember from her youth. The mare's breathing was labored now, her age showing in the careful placement of each hoof, but her determination never wavered. The mist hung thicker here beneath the canopy, caught between earth and sky, like the breath of sleeping giants. Ancient pines towered overhead, their trunks so massive that 3 men could not circle them with joined arms. These trees had been old when Sigrid's grandfather was young, witnesses to countless generations of human joy and sorrow. If trees could speak, what stories might they tell of the secrets buried beneath their roots? A raven called from somewhere high above, its harsh cry echoing through the silence like a warning. In the old stories, ravens were the eyes and ears of the All-Father, carrying messages between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Sigrid found herself looking up, searching the branches for the source of the call, but saw only shadow and mist. Fjara had stopped again, this time at what appeared to be a natural clearing, barely large enough for a horse and rider. But as Sigrid's eyes adjusted to the filtered light, she began to make out details that suggested human hands had shaped this space. Stones had been arranged in a rough circle, not randomly, but with the deliberate care of someone who understood their significance. The earth within the circle was slightly sunken, as if something had been buried there, and the ground had settled over time. The mare stood at the edge of this depression, her whole body trembling with an emotion Sigrid could not name. Fear, perhaps, or grief, or the strange recognition that comes when the past suddenly intrudes upon the present. Fjara's ears were pinned back against her skull, and she made a low sound in her throat that was neither whinny nor snort, but something more primal. "What is it, girl?" Sigrid whispered, approaching slowly. "What have you found?" The answer revealed itself as she drew closer to the sunken earth. Protruding from the moss and fallen leaves was the unmistakable curve of human ribs, yellowed with age and partially overgrown, but clearly visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Sigrid had seen enough battlefields in her youth to recognize the remains of the dead, even after decades had passed. Her first instinct was to step back, to cross herself and murmur a prayer for the poor soul who had found their final rest in this lonely place. But something kept her rooted to the spot, a growing certainty that this discovery was not the random encounter it appeared to be. Fjara had not led her here by accident. The mare had known, somehow, that these bones waited beneath the forest floor. Kneeling carefully beside the makeshift grave, Sigrid began to brush away the accumulated debris of years. Her fingers, steady despite the hammering of her heart, revealed more bones, arm bones, leg bones, the curve of a skull partially crushed by the weight of time and earth. And there, clutched in what had once been fingers, was something that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. A bone hairpin, carved with intricate patterns and stained dark with age, lay nestled against the ribs of the skeleton. The workmanship was unmistakably Norse, but the symbols carved into its surface were not from her own clan. She recognized the interlocked circles and angular runes of the Ironwood people, the same enemies Bjorn had marched to fight 20 years ago. But how had an Ironwood hairpin come to rest in the hands of someone buried in secret on her own clan's territory? The implications made her head spin. Had one of the enemy warriors somehow made it this far inland before being killed and hastily buried? But that made no sense. The battle had taken place 3 days' journey to the north, in the disputed valley called Ravenshollow. Unless the thought that began to form in her mind was so terrible that she tried to push it away, but it clung like a burr to woolen cloth. What if this grave contained not an enemy warrior, but one of their own people? What if the hairpin was not a possession, but evidence of some darker truth? Sigrid lifted the fragile object with trembling fingers, holding it up to catch what little light filtered through the canopy. The bone was old, certainly old enough to have lain here for 2 decades, but the carving was still clear enough to read. The runes spelled out a name in the ancient script, Valdis. She knew that name. Every child in the village knew the story of Valdis Ironwood's daughter, the enemy chieftain's daughter, who had supposedly been taken captive during the early fighting and held as a hostage to ensure good behavior from her people. According to the tales told around winter fires, she had been treated with honor and respect, fed well, and given freedom to move about the village under guard. When the final battle was won, she had been returned to her people as a gesture of magnanimity. But if Valdis had been returned safely to her clan, what was her hairpin doing in the skeletal grasp of someone buried in secret in these woods? Fjara nickered softly, a sound of deep sadness that seemed to acknowledge the weight of what they had discovered. The mare's dark eyes held an intelligence that sometimes unnerved Sigrid, as if the animal understood far more about human nature than humans understood about themselves. "You knew, didn't you?" Sigrid whispered, reaching out to stroke the horse's neck. "You've always known something was wrong. That's why you never forgot him, why you kept watching the woods all these years." The skeleton could be anyone, she told herself desperately. A traveler who had died of illness or injury and been buried by kind strangers. A criminal executed for some forgotten crime. A victim of wolves or bears whose body had been discovered too late for proper rites. There were any number of explanations that did not require her to question everything she had believed about her husband's death and the peace that had followed. But deep in her heart, In the place where a wife's intuition lived, she knew that this grave held answers to questions she had been afraid to ask. 20 years of careful silence, 20 years of accepted stories, 20 years of peace built on foundations that might crumble if examined too closely. The raven called again from the branches above, and this time Sigrid saw it, a large black bird with eyes like chips of obsidian, watching her with the patient interest of a judge weighing evidence. In the old stories, ravens could speak if they chose to, delivering messages from gods or the spirits of the dead. But this raven remained silent, offering no easy answers to the terrible questions that were beginning to multiply in her mind. She carefully wrapped the hairpin in a corner of her cloak and rose to her feet, her knees protesting the movement. The wedding feast would be starting soon, and her absence would be noticed. Gunnar would be worried, perhaps even angry. The guests would whisper about omens and ill fortune. The carefully negotiated peace between the clans might be strained by her inexplicable behavior. But she could not unsee what she had seen, could not unknow what the forest had revealed. Somewhere in the village, someone knew the truth about this grave. Someone had buried this person in secret and allowed 20 years of lies to accumulate, like fallen leaves over the evidence. And if they had lied about this, what else might they have lied about? The walk back to the village felt longer than the journey out, each step weighted with new knowledge and terrible possibilities. Fjara followed quietly behind her, the mare's mission apparently complete. Whatever had driven the horse to reveal this secret, the burden now rested on Sigrid's shoulders. As the longhouse came into view through the thinning trees, she could see figures moving about the yard, women in their festival clothes, children running between the buildings, men tending the cooking fires. The life she had planned to step into waited just beyond the forest edge, safe and predictable, and built on foundations she was no longer certain she could trust. But there was no going back now. The dead had spoken through horse and bone and ancient rune, and their message could not be ignored. Truth, like a river dammed too long, would find its way to the surface, whether anyone wanted it to or not. The longhouse felt like a cage when Sigrid finally returned from the forest, the bone hairpin hidden beneath her cloak like a burning coal against her ribs. The wedding preparations had continued in her absence, tables laden with honey cakes and roasted meat, ale barrels tapped and ready, garlands of late autumn flowers strung between the roof beams. The scene should have filled her with joy, but now it felt like a celebration built over a graveyard. Sigrid! Gunnar's voice carried relief and barely concealed frustration as he strode across the main hall toward her. His wedding clothes, a fine tunic of deep green wool with silver clasps at the shoulders, made him look every inch the chieftain. But worry lines creased his forehead. "Where have you been? The sun is past its peak, and the feast—" "I need time," she interrupted, the words coming out harsher than she intended. "I'm not feeling well. Perhaps we should postpone." "Postpone?" Eric Magnusson's voice cut through the hall like an axe blade. The village elder had been speaking with a group of visiting chieftains, but now he approached with the measured stride of a man accustomed to command. His grey beard was freshly braided with silver threads for the occasion, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made him the settlement's spokesman for more than a decade. "Sigrid, surely a bride's nerves are nothing that cannot be overcome with a cup of mead and the support of her sisters." The way he said it, dismissive, patronizing, made Sigrid's warrior instincts stir for the first time in years. She had faced armed enemies on blood-soaked fields, had made decisions that meant the difference between life and death for herself and others. She would not be reduced to a case of wedding nerves by a man who had never lifted a sword in anger. "It's not nerves," she said carefully, studying Eric's face for any telltale flicker of guilt or fear. "My horse led me into the woods this morning." She seemed to know something was there. For just a moment, less than a heartbeat, something shifted in Eric's expression. Fear? Recognition? It was gone so quickly she might have imagined it, replaced by the benevolent concern of an elder addressing a woman obviously overcome by the day's emotions. "Horses are strange creatures," he said, his tone gentle but firm. They sense things we cannot always understand, changes in weather, distant storms, the restlessness that comes before earthquakes. But we cannot allow their fears to govern our actions, especially not on such an important day. Astrid appeared at Sigrid's elbow, her young face bright with concern. "You're pale," she observed with the directness of youth, "and your dress is torn on the hem. What happened in the forest?" Before Sigrid could answer, Eric stepped smoothly into the conversation. "I'm sure it was nothing more than a difficult path and brambles. Sigrid, you should rest while the women help you prepare. A bride should not arrive at her own wedding looking as if she has been wrestling with trolls." The casual dismissal rankled, but Sigrid forced herself to nod and smile. If Eric was involved in whatever truth lay buried in those woods, she needed to be careful not to reveal her suspicions too early. "You're right, of course. I should make myself ready." But as she climbed the wooden stairs to her private chamber, the hairpin seemed to burn against her skin through the layers of cloth. Rest was the last thing on her mind. Instead, she went directly to the carved wooden chest that held her most precious possessions, the remnants of her life with Bjorn that she had preserved through 20 years of widowhood. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid and began sorting through the carefully wrapped bundles. Here was the silver arm ring Bjorn had given her on their wedding day, its surface engraved with running horses and runes of protection. Here was a lock of his dark hair, tied with a blue ribbon and still carrying the faint scent of the pine soap he had favored. Here was his eating knife, the bone handle worn smooth by his grip. But as she searched deeper into the chest, looking for other mementos that might shed light on his final days, her fingers encountered something that made her heart stop. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in a piece of faded silk, was Bjorn's silver arm, ring the twin to her own, the one he had worn every day of their marriage, the one that should have been on his arm when he died at Ravenshollow. Sigrid sank onto her bed, the arm ring heavy in her palm as lead. She remembered clearly the day the survivors had returned, their faces grim with the news of defeat turned to victory at terrible cost. They had brought back what personal effects they could recover from the battlefield, a few weapons, some jewelry, scraps of torn clothing that wives and mothers could use to fashion funeral shrouds for men whose bodies lay unburied in distant soil. But they had not brought back Bjorn's arm ring. When she had asked about it, the survivors had exchanged glances before one of them, she couldn't remember, which had spoken with the awkward gentleness men used when addressing a new widow. "His sword arm was severed in the fighting," the man had said. "The arm ring was lost with it. We searched, but the ravens and wolves—" He had not finished the sentence, letting her imagination fill in the horrible details. Now she held that supposedly lost ring in her hand, its silver surface unmarked by tooth or claw, its weight exactly as she remembered. How had it come to be in her own chest, wrapped with care and hidden among her most treasured possessions? She had no memory of placing it there, no recollection of anyone giving it to her, unless someone had put it there without her knowledge. Someone who had access to her home, her trust, her most private spaces. A soft knock on her door made her jump. "Sigrid?" Astrid's voice called through the wooden panels. "May I come in? I brought some wine to steady your nerves." Quickly, Sigrid wrapped the arm ring in its silk covering and placed it back in the chest. When she opened the door, the girl stood holding a ceramic cup that steamed with the scent of mulled wine and honey. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Astrid said, studying Sigrid's face with the perceptiveness that seemed to run in her bloodline. "Are you truly ill, or is something else troubling you?" For a moment, Sigrid was tempted to share her discoveries with this wise young woman, who would soon be her stepdaughter. But the implications were too dangerous, the questions too explosive to burden a girl with. If there was corruption in the village leadership, if the peace of 20 years was built on lies and murder, then knowledge of it could put Astrid in terrible danger. "Just wedding nerves," Sigrid lied, accepting the cup and taking a sip of the warming wine. "And perhaps a touch of sadness. It's difficult to let go of the past, even when the future promises happiness. Astrid settled herself on the edge of the bed, her grey eyes thoughtful. My mother used to say that the past and present are like threads in a tapestry. You cannot pull one without affecting the whole pattern. Perhaps the past doesn't want to be forgotten just yet. The words sent a chill through Sigrid that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the shutters. From the mouths of babes, she thought, remembering another old saying about the wisdom that sometimes came from unexpected sources. "Tell me about your mother," Sigrid said, settling beside the girl and wrapping her hands around the warm cup. What else did she used to say? She believed that truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how deeply people try to bury it. She said secrets are like seeds. They may lie dormant for years, but eventually they sprout and grow until they cannot be hidden anymore. Outside, the sounds of celebration continued. Laughter, music, the clatter of dishes being arranged for the feast. But inside the quiet chamber, two women sat in the growing shadows of afternoon, speaking of truth and secrets, while the weight of hidden knowledge pressed down like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The bone, hairpin and silver arm ring seemed to pulse with significance in their hiding places, evidence of lies that reached back 20 years and touched the very foundations of everything Sigrid had believed about her life. But evidence was not proof, and suspicion was not certainty. If she was going to uncover the truth about what had really happened to Bjorn and to the unfortunate soul buried in the forest, she would need to be very careful about who she trusted and how she proceeded. The wedding could wait. Justice, she was beginning to understand, could not. The evening feast proceeded without a bride, though Gunnar had done his best to salvage the situation by announcing that Sigrid had been taken with a sudden illness and the ceremony would be postponed until she recovered. The guests had accepted this explanation with varying degrees of disappointment and suspicion, but the food and ale flowed freely enough to keep most complaints to a minimum. From her chamber window, Sigrid watched the torchlit gathering in the yard below, feeling like a ghost observing the living. She should have been down there, accepting congratulations and gifts, dancing with her new husband while the musicians played the old songs. Instead, she sat in the growing darkness, turning Bjorn's arm ring over in her hands and trying to make sense of its impossible presence. A soft scratch at her door made her quickly hide the ring beneath her pillow. "Come," she called, expecting Astrid or perhaps one of the village women sent to check on her condition. Instead, Erik Magnusson stepped into the chamber, his festival clothes replaced by a simple brown tunic that made him look less like a celebrating elder and more like what he truly was, a man approaching his 60th winter with secrets weighing heavy on his shoulders. "I brought you some broth," he said, setting a wooden bowl on the small table beside her bed, "and I thought we might speak privately about what troubles you." The concern in his voice sounded genuine, but Sigrid had learned long ago that the most dangerous enemies were often those who wore the mask of friendship most convincingly. "I told you, I'm not feeling well. Nothing that rest won't cure." Erik settled himself on the wooden stool near her bed, his movements careful and deliberate. In the lamplight, she could see how much he had aged since Bjorn's death, his hair gone completely grey, his face carved with lines that spoke of hard decisions and harder knowledge. "I've known you since you were Astrid's age," he said quietly. "I watched you grow from a headstrong girl into a woman of wisdom and courage. I was there when you took up sword and shield to defend our borders, and I was there when you laid them down to grieve your husband. In all those years, I have never known you to be defeated by simple illness." The directness of his approach surprised her. She had expected him to maintain the pretense of wedding day nerves and feminine weakness. Instead, he seemed to be inviting her to speak honestly about whatever was troubling her. "Perhaps you're right," she said, testing the waters carefully. "Perhaps what ails me has more to do with the past than the present." Something flickered in Erik's eyes, relief, perhaps, or resignation. The past has a way of reaching out to claim us when we least expect it. "What did you find in the forest today, Sigrid?" The question hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge. She could lie, claim she had found nothing more than brambles and shadows, or she could reveal part of the truth and watch his reaction. The choice felt momentous, the kind of decision that would determine whether she found answers or buried herself alongside whatever secrets lay hidden in the village's history. "Bones," she said simply. "Very old bones, hidden in a place where no Christian burial should be." Eric's face went pale as winter moonlight, but his voice remained steady. "The forest is full of old graves. Our ancestors buried their dead beneath the trees long before the priests came with their stone churches and consecrated ground. These bones were not that old," Sigrid continued, watching his hands. The fingers that rested on his knees had begun to tremble slightly, though his expression remained carefully neutral. And they were not alone. She reached beneath her cloak and withdrew the bone hairpin, holding it up so the lamplight caught the carved runes. Eric's sharp intake of breath told her everything she needed to know about his familiarity with the object. "You recognize this?" she said. It was not a question. For a long moment, Eric stared at the hairpin without speaking. When he finally raised his eyes to meet hers, she saw something she had never expected to find there, genuine sorrow mixed with what might have been relief. "Valdis Ironwood's Dottir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wondered when someone would finally find her." The admission hit Sigrid like a physical blow. She had suspected, but having her fears confirmed still felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. She was supposed to have been returned to her people after the war. Everyone said what they were told to say. Eric interrupted, the words tumbling out as if a dam had finally burst inside him. What they needed to say to keep the peace. What really happened to her? Eric rose from the stool and walked to the window, staring out at the feast that continued below them. The torchlight painted his profile in harsh lines and deep shadows, making him look older than his years. "She was never a hostage," he said finally. "She came to us freely, seeking refuge from her own father's plans to marry her to a brutal man from a distant clan. She had fallen in love with someone from our village, a young warrior who had met her during the summer trading gatherings." Sigrid's heart began to pound as the implications became clear. Bjorn. Yes, the word fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of understanding through everything she thought she knew about her husband's final months. He was going to divorce you and take her as his wife, according to the old customs. The marriage would have united the clans without bloodshed, ended the feud through love instead of war. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade. 20 years of faithful mourning, 20 years of honoring a man who had been planning to abandon her for another woman. 20 years of grief built on a foundation of lies. "But that's not what happened," she managed to say through the tightness, and in her throat, "No." Eric turned back to face her, and she could see tears glistening in the lamplight. "There were those who believed such a marriage would weaken our position, make us look weak in the eyes of other clans. They thought it better to settle the matter with steel than with wedding vows." "Who?" The question came out as a growl that would have done credit to a cornered wolf. "Men who are dead now, mostly. Men who acted in what they believed were the village's best interests." He paused, gathering courage for what came next. "And some who still live and have carried the weight of that decision for 20 years. The fragments of truth were beginning to assemble themselves into a picture more terrible than anything she could have imagined. Not just Valdis buried in secret, but a conspiracy that reached into the heart of the village leadership. A conspiracy that had cost her husband his life and stolen 20 years of truth from everyone who mourned him. "Tell me." "Everything," she said, her voice carrying the authority she had once used to command warriors on the battlefield. "Tell me exactly what happened, and leave nothing out." Eric nodded slowly, like a man accepting judgment for crimes long hidden. "It will mean the end of everything we've built these past 20 years. The peace, the alliances, the trust between the clans, all of it will crumble when the truth comes out." "Then let it crumble," Sigrid replied, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. Some things are more important than peace built on lies. Outside, the feast continued, but inside the small chamber, the careful structure of 2 decades was about to come crashing down around the ears of those who had built it on blood and deception. Eric's confession unfolded like a poisonous flower blooming in the darkness, each revelation more devastating than the last. But even as he spoke of conspiracies and hidden murders, Sigrid sensed he was holding back the deepest truths, parceling out his guilt in carefully measured portions. "I need to see for myself," she said, when his voice finally trailed into silence. "If there are more secrets buried in those woods, I need to find them before I decide what to do with this knowledge." "Sigrid, please, no." The word came out with the finality of a sword stroke. 20 years ago, you and the others made decisions that shaped my entire life without giving me a voice in the matter. I will not be silenced again. Eric's shoulders sagged with the weight of defeat. Then I will come with you. There are paths you would not find on your own. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with frost silvering the grass and a sharp wind carrying the promise of winter. Sigrid had spent the sleepless hours before dawn gathering supplies: her old hunting knife, a coil of rope, a leather satchel for whatever artifacts they might discover. She had also retrieved something from the depths of her storage chest that she had not touched in 20 years, a fragment of battle banner, torn and stained with what might have been blood or rust. She had found it among Bjorn's possessions after his death, a piece of red wool bearing the raven sigil of their clan. At the time, she had assumed it was a scrap torn from the battle standard during the fighting at Raven Shallow. Now, she wondered if it might tell a different story entirely. Astrid was waiting in the stable when Sigrid arrived to saddle Fjara, the girl's face set with determination that reminded Sigrid powerfully of herself at that age. "I'm coming with you," Astrid announced before Sigrid could speak. "This is not a matter for young women. My mother died asking questions about that battle," Astrid interrupted, her grey eyes flashing with anger and pain. She never believed the stories the survivors told. She kept asking why so few men returned, why the details kept changing in the telling, why certain names were never mentioned when they spoke of the heroic dead. Sigrid paused in adjusting Fjara's bridle, struck by this unexpected revelation. What questions? She had been keeping track of the men who marched out and the men who came back. The numbers didn't match the official accounts. There were too many missing, even accounting for those confirmed dead. She thought some of the men might have deserted rather than fight, or been killed by their own comrades for cowardice. The implications sent ice through Sigrid's veins. If Gunnar's wife had been investigating the battle, asking dangerous questions, then her death from fever might not have been as natural as everyone believed. What happened to her notes, her records? Father burned them after she died. He said they were the obsessions of a sick mind, that grief had made her see conspiracies where none existed. Astrid's voice dropped to a whisper. "But I saved some of them. I was only 13, but I knew they were important." The girl led them to a contection, hiding place in the stable's loft, a loose board that concealed a small bundle wrapped in oiled leather. Inside were several pieces of bark paper covered with careful runic notations, lists of names, dates, fragments of conversations overheard at market gatherings. "Look at this," Astrid said, pointing to a particular passage. She wrote that Bjorn was seen in the village 3 days after he was supposed to have died at Raven Shallow. A trader from the northern settlements claimed to have sold him supplies for a journey. Sigrid's hands shook as she read the careful script. If this was true, if Bjorn had survived the battle and returned home, then everything about his death was a lie. But why would he have come back in secret? And what had happened to him after that mysterious sighting? Eric appeared in the doorway of the stable, his face grim in the morning light. "Are you ready?" he asked, then stopped when he saw the papers in Sigrid's hands. "What are those?" "More questions that need answers," Sigrid replied, carefully folding the documents and placing them in her satchel. It seems your wife was not the only one who doubted the official story. Eric's face went ashen. Ingrid's notes? You thought you had destroyed all the evidence. Astrid finished coldly. But the truth has a way of surviving, doesn't it? The girl's words hung in the air like an accusation as the three of them made their way back into the forest. This time, Eric led the way, following paths that were invisible to Sigrid's eyes, but clearly familiar to him. Fjara walked quietly behind them, her earlier agitation replaced by a calm purposefulness, as if she sensed that her mission was nearing completion. Deep in the woods, where the ancient pines grew so thick that noon felt like twilight, Eric stopped at what appeared to be a natural boulder, partially overgrown with moss and ferns. But when Sigrid looked more closely, she could see tool marks on the stones, surface deliberate carving that formed a rough map of the local terrain. A rune stone, she breathed, recognizing the craftsmanship even beneath decades of accumulated growth. But it's not ancient. 20 years old, Eric confirmed, his voice heavy with shame. We carved it to mark the secret ways, the paths that could be used to move between settlements without being seen by enemies or friends. Astrid began carefully clearing away the moss, revealing more of the carved surface. The stone showed not just paths, but locations marked with different symbols: a hammer for the smith's forge, a sheaf of grain for the storage houses, crossed swords for what might have been meeting places or battlegrounds. But it was the network of hidden trails that caught Sigrid's attention. According to this map, there were ways to move through the forest that would allow someone to travel between villages, to the disputed borderlands, even to the enemy settlements, without using the main roads where they might be seen and questioned. Someone could have used these paths to send word to the Ironwood people, she said, understanding beginning to dawn. Someone could have told them exactly when and where our warriors would be, what route they would take, how many men would be in the warband. Yes, Eric whispered, the word barely audible above the wind in the trees. Who had access to this information? Who knew these paths well enough to use them for betrayal? Eric's silence stretched until it became an answer in itself. When he finally spoke, his voice was that of a broken man confessing his deepest sins. All of us, he said, all of the village elders knew. We carved this map together, thinking it would give us advantage in the coming war. Instead, it became the tool of our own undoing. The wind picked up, sending dead leaves swirling around them like the ghosts of the betrayed. Somewhere in these woods lay more secrets, more evidence of the conspiracy that had cost so many lives and stolen so many years of truth. But with each revelation, Sigrid realized she was not just uncovering the past, she was walking deeper into danger that still threatened anyone who came too close to the truth. The dead might speak through horse and bone and hidden stone, but the living, she was learning, would go to great lengths to keep their secrets buried. The journey deeper into the forest revealed more than hidden paths and carved stones. As they followed the ancient trails marked on the runestone map, Sigrid began to understand the true scope of the conspiracy that had shaped the last 20 years of their lives. These were not random acts of violence born from the heat of war, but carefully planned deceptions that reached into every aspect of village life. They had been walking for most of the morning when Astrid suddenly stopped, pointing to a grove of birch trees whose white bark stood out like bones against the darker pines. There, she said, her voice tight with recognition. Mother brought me here once, just before she died. She said this place held answers, but she was too afraid to look for them alone. The grove felt different from the rest of the forest, quieter, as if the very air held its breath in anticipation. Even Fjara seemed reluctant to enter, her hooves picking carefully across ground that looked no different from any other patch of woodland floor. But as they moved deeper among the birch trees, Sigrid began to notice details that spoke of human presence. Stones arranged in patterns that seemed random but felt deliberate. Scratches on tree bark that might have been natural damage or might have been messages carved by careful hands. And there, half buried beneath fallen leaves and the accumulated debris of 20 winters, the unmistakable gleam of worked metal. A knife, Eric said, his voice hollow with recognition as Sigrid knelt to examine the find. Bjorn's knife, I would know it anywhere. The staff, the weapon was in far better condition than anything buried for 2 decades should have been. The iron blade, though darkened with age, showed no signs of rust or decay that would come from long exposure to the elements. The bone handle, carved with the interlaced knots that had been Bjorn's personal mark, was smooth and unmarked by weather. Sigrid lifted the knife with trembling hands, turning it over to examine every detail. On the blade, near the hilt, were stains that might have been rust, but felt more ominous in this place of hidden truths. And wrapped around the handle, so tightly it had become part of the weapon itself, was a thin strip of cloth-red wool that matched perfectly the battle banner fragment she carried in her satchel. This was not lost in battle, she said, her voice carrying the certainty of long experience with weapons and their care. This knife was cleaned and cared for after whatever happened here. Someone wrapped it deliberately, preserved it like a sacred relic. Astrid had wandered a few paces away, following some instinct of her own among the birch trees. Now she called out, her young voice sharp with discovery and fear. Here, both of you need to see this. They found her standing beside what looked like a natural depression in the earth, but which revealed itself under closer examination to be another grave larger than the one that had held Valdis's remains, and more carefully constructed. Stones had been placed to mark the boundaries, and though grass and saplings had grown over the site, the outline was still visible to eyes that knew what to look for. 2 graves, Sigrid whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. Valdis and Bjorn, Eric finished, the name falling from his lips like a prayer or a curse. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with horrible clarity. Bjorn had not died in battle at Ravenshollow. He had returned home, perhaps with Valdis, perhaps planning to claim his right to divorce and remarry, according to the old laws. But the village elders had other plans, other priorities than love or individual happiness. You killed them both, Sigrid said, her hand moving instinctively to the hilt of her hunting knife. You murdered my husband and an innocent woman to prevent a marriage that would have brought peace without bloodshed. It wasn't supposed to happen that way, Eric said, his words tumbling out in a rush of desperate justification. We only meant to talk to them, to explain why such a marriage would be impossible. The clans were already gathering for war. Too much blood had been spilled, too many insults exchanged. A political marriage at that point would have been seen as weakness, cowardice in the face of enemy aggression. So you decided murder was preferable to the appearance of weakness. We tried to reason with him, Eric continued, as if her accusation was a physical blow he had to defend against. We offered him gold, land, even a position of leadership in the coming war, but he refused to listen. He said he loved her, that he would rather face exile than give her up. Astrid had been listening to this exchange with growing horror and anger. Now she stepped forward, her young face set with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to those who see evil stripped of its justifications. "And what about my mother?" she demanded. "Did you try to reason with her too, before she died so conveniently of fever?" Eric's silence was answer enough. The girl's intuition had cut straight to the heart of another murder, another life taken to preserve the conspiracy's secrets. She was getting too close to the truth, he finally admitted. Asking questions at markets and trade gatherings, comparing stories from different settlements. Someone would have listened to her eventually, someone with the power to demand a formal investigation. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking in its casual cruelty. Not just the original murders, but the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened to expose the truth. How many others had died over the years to keep this secret? How many convenient accidents and sudden illnesses had actually been carefully planned executions? Who else knows? Sigrid asked, her voice deadly calm despite the rage building in her chest. How many people have been part of this conspiracy? Most of the current village elders, Eric said, seeming to age years with each word, and some of the warriors who helped stage the fake battle reports, not many, the fewer who knew, the safer the secret. Including Gunnar, the question hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Everything about her planned marriage, her chance at happiness and family, depended on the answer. His father knew, Eric said carefully. Old Thorfinn was one of the architects of the plan. But Gunnar himself, he was away at the southern settlements when it happened. He knows only what we told him when he returned. Relief and despair warred in Sigrid's heart. Her intended husband was innocent of the murders, but his family's position, his very claim to leadership, was built on the foundation of his father's crimes. If the truth came out, it would destroy him as surely as it would destroy Eric and the other conspirators. "What am I supposed to do with this knowledge?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The dead demanded justice, but justice would shatter the peace that had protected both villages for 20 years. Truth would bring chaos, perhaps renewed war between the clans, certainly the destruction of everything that had been built on the gravesites of Bjorn and Valdis. But could she live with herself if she allowed the lies to continue? Could she marry Gunnar, knowing that his family's power came from her husband's blood? Could she face Astrid every day, knowing that the girl's mother had been murdered for asking the same questions Sigrid was asking now? The knife in her hands seemed to pulse with the weight of unfinished business, while around them the birch trees whispered secrets that had been kept too long in darkness. Some truths, she was learning, were too heavy for one person to carry alone. The confrontation with Eric had drained something essential from all three of them, leaving them moving through the forest like sleepwalkers, navigating a nightmare. The weight of 20 years of lies pressed down on Sigrid's shoulders until each step felt like a monumental effort. Beside her, Astrid walked in silence, her young face aged by the knowledge of her mother's murder. Even Fjara seemed subdued, her usual alertness replaced by the weary patience of a creature whose long burden was finally nearing its end. They were making their way back toward the village when Eric suddenly stopped, his hand raised in warning. Through the trees ahead, they could see smoke rising, not the thin wisps of cooking fires, but thick black columns that spoke of buildings burning out of control. "The village," Astrid breathed, her face going pale with fear. They ran then, crashing through undergrowth and leaping fallen logs with desperate urgency. As they drew closer to the settlement, the acrid smell of smoke grew stronger, mixed with other scents that made Sigrid's warrior instincts scream warnings: the metallic tang of blood, the sour stench of fear, the underlying sweetness that meant death had come calling. The scene that greeted them at the forest's edge was chaos incarnate. Half the longhouses were ablaze, their timber walls and thatched roofs feeding flames that reached toward the grey sky like grasping fingers. Bodies lay scattered in the yard, some villagers, but others wearing the distinctive iron-studded leather of the Ironwood clan warriors. "No," Eric whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of understanding. "This cannot be happening. The peace treaty." "What peace treaty?" The voice came from behind them, cold and familiar. They turned to find Gunnar emerging from the trees, but not alone. With him came a dozen warriors in full battle gear, their weapons drawn and their faces set with grim purpose. But it was the figure at Gunnar's side that made Sigrid's blood freeze in her veins. A woman of perhaps 30 winters, tall and proud, with the pale hair and grey eyes that marked her as Ironwood-born. She wore armor like a queen, her sword belt hung with the trophies of many battles, and around her neck gleamed a silver torque that marked her as nobility among her people. "Sigrid Bjornsdottir," the woman said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "I am Helga Valdisdottir. I've come to collect a debt that has been owed for 20 years. The world seemed to tilt sideways as the implications hit home. Valdis had not been an only child, had not died without family to mourn her passing. This woman, this warrior queen, was her sister, and she had come for revenge. "You're supposed to be dead," Eric stammered, his face white with terror. "The fever that swept through the Ironwood settlements 5 years ago. We heard you had died, with most of your clan's leadership." Helga's smile was sharp as a blade's edge. "Convenient rumors spread by those who wished to lull their enemies into complacency. Did you really think the death of a chieftain's daughter would go uninvestigated forever? Did you believe that lies told loudly enough would become truth simply through repetition?" Gunnar stepped forward, his expression torn between confusion and growing understanding. "Helga has been my ally for 3 years, he said, his voice hollow with the weight of betrayal. "She approached me with evidence of my father's crimes, proof that the peace between our clans was built on murder and deception. The marriage proposal, the alliance between our settlements, it was all part of a larger plan to bring the truth to light." The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Gunnar's courtship had not been motivated by love or political necessity, but by justice. He had known about his father's involvement in the conspiracy, had been working with Valdis's sister to expose the truth and exact revenge. "And I," Sigrid said, her voice barely above a whisper, "was the perfect tool for your vengeance. The grieving widow who could be manipulated into uncovering evidence, who would do your investigative work while believing she was acting from her own curiosity." "No," Gunnar said, taking a step toward her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "It began that way, yes, but Sigrid, what grew between us was built on lies, just like everything else," she finished, the betrayal cutting deeper than any physical wound. Even her chance at love, her hope for a future beyond grief and solitude, had been nothing more than an elaborate deception designed to serve someone else's agenda. Astrid looked from one adult face to another, her young features twisted with confusion and hurt. Then none of it was real? The wedding, the alliance, the promise of peace, all of it was just a game played with other people's lives? "The peace was always an illusion," Helga said, her voice gentling slightly as she addressed the girl. "Built on the bones of the murdered, sustained by the silence of the guilty. True peace can only come when justice has been served and the dead have been properly honored." Eric had been backing away slowly during this exchange, his eyes darting between the armed warriors and the forest paths that might offer escape. But his movement had not gone unnoticed. 2 of Helga's men moved to block his retreat, their weapons held ready, but not yet threatening. "Eric Magnusson," Helga said, her attention turning to the village elder like a hawk focusing on wounded prey. "You have carried the weight of your crimes for 20 years. Are you ready to confess them before witnesses, or must we extract the truth through less pleasant means?" "I have already confessed," Eric said, his voice shaking with fear and resignation. "Sigrid knows everything, the murders, the conspiracy, the cover-up that followed. What more do you want from me?" "I want the names of every person involved. I want the location of every piece of evidence. And I want a formal confession that can be presented to the clan councils of both settlements." Helga's voice was implacable, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Justice delayed is not justice denied, but it is justice that demands a fuller accounting." From her cloak, Helga withdrew a rolled parchment sealed with red wax. "I carry the authority of both clan councils to investigate these crimes and render judgment according to the old laws. The time for secrets and half-truths is over." Sigrid stared at the official seal, recognizing the symbols that marked it as genuine. This was not a simple revenge quest, but a formal legal proceeding that would have consequences, reaching far beyond their small village. When the truth finally came out, it would reshape the political landscape of the entire region. "And what of the innocent?" she asked, thinking of the villagers who had known nothing of the conspiracy, who had built their lives on the foundation of lies they had been told. "What of those who trusted their leaders and believed the stories they were given?" "The innocent will be protected," Helga assured her. "But those who participated in murder, who profited from deception, who silenced the voices that tried to speak truth, they will face the consequences of their choices." The sound of hoofbeats approaching through the trees announced the arrival of more warriors, these bearing the standards of both clans. The formal investigation Helga had promised was already underway, and there would be no escape for those whose guilt could be proven. But as Sigrid watched the carefully orchestrated revelation unfold around her, she realized that her own role in this drama was far from over. She was not just a victim of the conspiracy or a tool for its exposure. She was a witness whose testimony would determine the fate of everyone involved. The question now was whether she had the courage to speak the truth, knowing that it would destroy not only the guilty, but the carefully constructed peace that had protected both communities for 20 years. The dead demanded justice, but the living deserved consideration too. In her hands, Bjorn's knife seemed to pulse with expectation, while around her the future balanced on the edge of a blade that could cut either toward justice or toward the preservation of a flawed but functional peace. The choice, she realized, was ultimately hers to make. The ancient truth stone stood in the center of the village square, like a silent judge presiding over 20 years of accumulated lies. Carved from granite, older than memory, and worn smooth by countless hands that had sworn oaths upon its surface, the stone had witnessed every significant moment in the settlement's history: marriages, trials, declarations of war, and promises of peace. Now it would witness something that might destroy everything the village had become. The fires had been extinguished, but the smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air, mixing with the tension that crackled between the assembled clans like lightning waiting to strike. Warriors from both settlements stood in carefully arranged groups, their hands never far from their weapons, despite the formal truce that Helga had declared for the duration of the proceedings. The surviving villagers huddled together, their faces showing the confusion and fear of people whose world had been turned upside down in the space of a single day. Sigrid stood at the edge of the crowd, feeling the weight of every gaze that fell upon her. Word had spread quickly through both camps that she was the one who had uncovered the evidence, the one whose questions had finally broken open the conspiracy that had shaped their lives for 2 decades. Some looked at her with gratitude, others with accusation, as if she were responsible for the chaos rather than merely the instrument of its revelation. Astrid stayed close beside her, the girl's young face set with determination that reminded Sigrid painfully of herself at that age. The loss of every adult she had trusted, first her mother to mysterious illness, now her father to the revelation of his manipulation, and finally Eric to the exposure of his crimes, had aged Astrid beyond her 16 years. Yet she carried herself with the dignity of someone who understood that truth, however painful, was preferable to the comfort of lies. "Are you ready for this?" Astrid asked quietly, her hand finding Sigrid's and squeezing gently. The question carried layers of meaning that went far beyond the immediate moment. Was she ready to speak the truth that would destroy the peace 20 years in the making? Was she ready to face the consequences of choices made by people long dead? Was she ready to step into the role of judge and witness that fate had thrust upon her? "I'm not sure anyone can be ready for something like this," Sigrid replied, watching as Helga approached the truth stone with the formal bearing of someone about to conduct a trial that would reshape the political landscape of the region. Gunnar stood apart from both groups, his position as ambiguous as his loyalties. The revelation that he had been working with Helga to expose his own father's crimes had earned him suspicion from his own people and conditional acceptance from the Ironwood clan. His eyes sought Sigrid's across the crowd, carrying a message of regret and plea for understanding that she was not yet ready to receive. The betrayal of his deception cut deeper than the original murders in some ways. Eric and the other conspirators had acted from motives she could understand, even if she could not forgive them. Fear, tribal loyalty, the desire to protect their people from what they saw as a dangerous weakness. These were human failings that at least made sense. But Gunnar's manipulation of her feelings, his calculated courtship designed to make her a more effective investigator, felt like a violation of something sacred. Eric had been brought forward under guard, his hands bound with rope and his face bearing the grey pallor of a man who had accepted his doom. Behind him came 3 other village elders, their expressions ranging from defiant anger to resigned despair. These were men Sigrid had known her entire life, men who had taught her children's games and praised her warrior skills and comforted her in her widowhood. The knowledge that they had been living lies all this time made her question every memory, every moment of trust and affection. Helga raised her hand for silence, and the murmur of conversation that had been rippling through the crowd died away like wind before a storm. In the sudden quiet, the distant call of ravens could be heard from the forest, as if the messengers of the gods had come to witness this moment of reckoning. "People of both clans," Helga began, her voice carrying easily across the square. "We gather today not to seek vengeance, but to serve justice. For 20 years, the peace between our settlements has been built on a foundation of lies and murder. Today, that foundation will be exposed to the light, and true peace, peace based on honesty and accountability, can finally begin." She gestured toward the evidence that had been arranged on a wooden table beside the truth stone. Bjorn's knife lay gleaming in the afternoon light, its blade catching the sun like a signal fire. Beside it rested the bone hairpin that had belonged to Valdis, the silver arm ring that should have been lost in battle, and the parchment bearing Eric's formal confession. "But before we proceed with the accusations and judgments," Helga continued, "we must hear from those who lived with the consequences of the crimes committed 20 years ago. The dead cannot speak for themselves, but the living can speak for the dead." All eyes turned toward Sigrid, and she felt the moment crystallize around her like ice forming on still water. Everything that followed would depend on what she said next, how she chose to frame the truth that had been revealed. She could soften the blow, emphasize the complexity of the situation, appeal for mercy and understanding. Or she could speak with the cold precision of a warrior delivering a killing stroke, demanding justice, regardless of the consequences. Bjorn's knife seemed to call to her from the evidence table, its familiar weight remembered in her hand, even after 20 years. But as she started toward the truth stone, another object caught her attention. A horn hanging from Helga's belt, carved with intricate designs and bound with silver wire. It was clearly ancient, a relic of considerable importance, and something about it tugged at memories she couldn't quite place. "The spirit horn?" Astrid whispered beside her, recognition dawning in her grey eyes. "It belonged to your husband. Mother told me about it once, how Bjorn's family had kept it for generations, how it was used to call the clan to witness important declarations." The sight of the horn completed something in Sigrid's understanding. This was not just about justice for the murdered, but about restoring honor to those who had been wronged. Bjorn had died not as a hero in glorious battle, but as a victim of political calculation and tribal fear. His memory had been shaped by lies, his sacrifice diminished by deception. The horn offered a way to let him speak one final time, to ensure that his true story would be heard and remembered. Helga seemed to understand the significance of the moment. She lifted the horn from her belt and held it out to Sigrid, her expression solemn with the weight of ceremony. "This belonged to your husband," she said formally. "By right of blood and marriage, it should have passed to you when he died. Today, it returns to its proper owner." The horn was heavier than Sigrid had expected, its carved surface warm from contact with Helga's body. As her fingers traced the ancient patterns, she felt a connection to something larger than herself, the unbroken chain of ancestors who had used this same horn to call their people to witness truth and justice. Around the square, the tension was building like pressure before a thunderstorm. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered and retold for generations. The choice Sigrid made now would not just determine the fate of the conspirators, but would set the tone for relations between the clans for years to come. Eric raised his head to look at her directly, his eyes carrying a plea that she could not quite interpret. Was he asking for mercy? or simply for the chance to face his judgment with dignity? The other accused elders watched her with expressions ranging from hope to resignation, each man calculating his chances of survival based on words not yet spoken. But it was Gunnar's gaze that cut deepest. Despite everything, the manipulation, the lies, the revelation that their entire relationship had been built on deception, she could still see something in his eyes that might have been genuine feeling. Perhaps love could grow even in soil poisoned by ulterior motives. Perhaps his feelings had become real, even if his initial approach had been calculated. The horn grew warm in her hands as she raised it to her lips, feeling the weight of 20 years of silence about to be broken. In the old traditions, the call of the spirit horn commanded absolute attention, demanded that all present listen to the words that followed, as if they carried the authority of the gods themselves. The first note rang out clear and strong, echoing off the longhouse walls, and seeming to penetrate the very air with its ancient power. As the sound faded, perfect silence fell over the assembled clans, broken only by the distant whisper of wind through the forest trees. Sigrid lowered the horn and stepped forward to place her hand upon the truth stone, feeling its cool surface against her palm, like the touch of eternity itself. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had looked into the heart of darkness and chosen to bring light. "I call upon the living to witness for the dead," she began, the formal words coming to her as if whispered by ancestral spirits. "I call upon the guilty to answer for their crimes, and upon the innocent to receive justice long denied." The die was cast. There could be no turning back now from whatever consequences her testimony would bring. The echo of the spirit horn faded into silence that felt dense as storm clouds. Every face in the square turned toward Sigrid as she stood with her palm pressed against the ancient truth stone, feeling its weathered surface ground her to the earth and the weight of generations who had sworn oaths upon its granite face. 20 years ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered clans, "I kissed my husband farewell and watched him march away to war. I believed I was sending him to fight for our honor, our territory, our people's future. I never saw him alive again." Eric shifted uncomfortably in his bonds, but the warriors guarding him pressed closer, ensuring his silence. "The survivors told me he died bravely at Ravenshollow, that his sword arm was severed in the fighting, that his body was lost to ravens and wolves. They brought me fragments of his clothing and spoke of his heroic last stand, assured me that his sacrifice had meaning." Her voice grew stronger with each word, fueled by the righteous anger that had been building for days. "I mourned him as a hero. I honored his memory as a faithful wife. For 20 years, I shaped my life around the grief of losing him to noble war." The crowd remained absolutely still, mesmerized by the raw emotion in her testimony. Some of the older women had tears in their eyes, remembering their own losses from that terrible conflict. "But my husband did not die at Ravenshollow," Sigrid continued, lifting Bjorn's knife from the evidence table. "He died here, in our own forest, killed not by enemy weapons, but by the men he trusted. Men who decided his love was more dangerous than any foreign army." A ripple of shocked murmurs ran through the crowd, but Helga's sharp gesture restored silence. Bjorn had fallen in love with Valdis Ironwoodsdottir, and she with him. Their marriage would have ended the blood feud between our clans without a single death in battle. It would have created an alliance built on affection rather than fear, trust rather than submission. Sigrid's gaze swept across the assembled faces, seeing recognition dawn in many eyes. But love was not enough, for those who preferred the certainty of war to the vulnerability of peace. Eric tried to speak, but one of his guards placed a firm hand on his shoulder, reinforcing the requirement for silence during formal testimony. "They came to him in the forest," Sigrid said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more power than shouting. "Eric Magnusson and others among the village leadership. They offered him gold, land, positions of honor, anything except the right to follow his heart. When he refused their bribes, when he chose love over political convenience, they chose murder over accepting his decision. She held up the bone hairpin, its carved surface catching the afternoon light. Valdis died with him, this token of her identity clutched in her hand as she tried to defend the man she loved. Two young people, guilty of nothing more than believing that peace was possible, killed by those who found war more profitable than harmony. The weight of accumulated lies was crashing down around them like a dam, finally giving way to pressure too long contained. Sigrid could see it in the faces of the crowd, the recognition, the horror, the terrible understanding of how thoroughly they had all been deceived. But the murders were only the beginning of the betrayal, she continued, her voice growing harder with each revelation. The killers created an elaborate fiction to cover their crimes. They staged reports from a battle that never happened as they described it. They produced evidence of deaths that occurred in forest graves rather than on distant battlefields. They allowed families to mourn heroes who were actually victims of political calculation. Astrid stepped forward from the crowd, her young voice clear and strong, as she added her testimony to Sigrid's. My mother discovered inconsistencies in the battle reports. She kept records, asked questions, compared stories. When she came too close to the truth, she died of a convenient fever that left no marks and took no other victims. The girl's words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Many of these people had loved Ingrid, had mourned her passing as a tragic loss to illness. To learn that she had been murdered for seeking truth added another layer of horror to the conspiracy's scope. Eric could no longer contain himself. "You don't understand," he burst out, struggling against his guards. The clans were already gathering for war. Blood had been spilled on both sides. If we had allowed that marriage, it would have been seen as weakness, surrender in the face of enemy pressure. Other clans would have descended on us like wolves on wounded deer. So you chose to be the wolves yourselves, Sigrid replied, her voice cutting through his justifications like a blade through cloth. You chose to murder innocence rather than trust in the possibility that love might be stronger than hate. The formal testimony was building toward its climax, but already Sigrid could see the impact of her words rippling through the crowd. Some faces showed shock and horror, others anger at the deception they had lived with for so long. A few showed something that might have been relief, the expression of people who had carried suspicions for years and were finally seeing them confirmed. But it was Gunnar's face that drew her attention most strongly. The man she had planned to marry stood apart from both groups, his expression unreadable as he listened to the systematic destruction of everything his family's leadership had built. The moment of final judgment was approaching, and with it, the choice that would determine not just the fate of the conspirators, but the future relationship between the clans. The crowd erupted like a pot finally boiling over. Shouts of anger and disbelief rang across the square as the full implications of the testimony sank into minds that had lived with comfortable lies for 20 years. Some villagers turned on the accused elders with fury, while others seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of the deception that had shaped their entire adult lives. "Murderers!" someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "You killed our sons for nothing!" "The peace was built on blood," cried another voice, thick with grief and rage. Helga raised her hand, her authority cutting through the chaos like a sword through silk. "There will be order," she commanded, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This is a formal proceeding, not a mob riot. The accused will have their chance to speak before judgment is rendered." But Eric was beyond caring about proper procedure. The weight of 20 years of guilt and fear had finally broken whatever restraint he had maintained, and words poured from him like blood from a mortal wound. "Yes, we killed them," he cried, his voice cracking with emotion. "We killed them because we had no choice. You think love conquers all? You think pretty words and wedding vows can erase generations of blood feud? The Ironwood clans had already burned 3 of our outlying farms. They had taken hostages, killed our traders, violated every treaty we had ever signed with them. Helga's face remained impassive, but Sigrid could see the muscles in her jaw tighten at Eric's words. And yet you were willing to make peace with us now, when it served your purposes. That's different, Eric protested, though his voice carried less conviction than before. Time has passed. The old grievances have faded. Both sides have grown weary of conflict. Or perhaps, Sigrid interjected, stepping closer to where Eric stood, surrounded by his guards, you finally realize that murder creates more problems than it solves. How many more people have died over the years to keep your secret safe? How many convenient accidents and mysterious illnesses? The question hit its mark. Eric's face went grey as old parchment, and several of the other accused elders exchanged glances that spoke of shared guilt, reaching far beyond the original crimes. It was then that Gunnar finally stepped forward, his movement breaking the careful neutrality he had maintained throughout the proceedings. All eyes turned toward him as he approached the truth stone, his face set with the terrible resolve of someone about to sacrifice everything for the sake of honesty. "There's more," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent square. "More that needs to be said if we're truly going to have justice here today." Sigrid felt her heart clench with dread. She had thought the worst revelations were behind them, but the expression on Gunnar's face suggested that deeper horrors were yet to be uncovered. "My father was not just a participant in the conspiracy," Gunnar continued, his words falling like hammer blows on anvil steel. "He was its architect. The plan to kill Bjorn and Valdis, the elaborate fiction about the battle at Ravenshollow, the systematic elimination of anyone who asked too many questions, all of it originated with Thorfinn Gunnarsson." The admission sent another shockwave through the crowd. Many of these people had respected Gunnar's father, had looked to him for leadership and guidance. To learn that he had been the mastermind behind such extensive deception and murder was almost too much to absorb. "But there's something else," Gunnar said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout. "Something that even Eric and the others don't know." He reached into his tunic and withdrew a small object wrapped in dark cloth. When he unwrapped it, the crowd gasped collectively at what was revealed: a blood debt blade, its iron surface etched with the ancient runes that marked it as a weapon of formal justice according to the oldest Norse laws. "This is Bjorn's ancestral sword," Gunnar said, holding the blade so that its surface caught the light like captured fire. "It has been in his family for 7 generations, passed down from father to son as a symbol of honor and duty. It should have passed to his children or to his widow when he died." Sigrid's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the weapon. She had seen it many times during their marriage, hanging on the wall of their longhouse like a sacred relic. After Bjorn's death, she had been told it was lost in the battle, taken by enemy warriors as a trophy. "My father took this blade from Bjorn's body after the murder," Gunnar continued, his voice heavy with shame and sorrow. "He kept it as a trophy, a reminder of his victory over those who would have chosen love over war. For 20 years, it has hung in our great hall, hidden in plain sight as a monument to successful deception." The revelation was devastating in its implications. Not only had the conspirators murdered Bjorn and Valdis, but they had desecrated his memory by stealing the symbol of his family's honor. It was a violation that went beyond simple killing into the realm of spiritual destruction. "I return this blade to its rightful owner," Gunnar said, holding the sword out toward Sigrid. "And I submit myself to whatever justice she deems appropriate for the crimes my family has committed against hers." The moment crystallized around them like ice forming on still water. Everything that followed would depend on what Sigrid chose to do with the power that had been placed in her hands. The weight of Bjorn's ancestral sword in Sigrid's hands felt like holding the concentrated essence of 20 years of grief, anger, and betrayal. The blade that should have been passed down through generations of their children now rested in her palm, its iron surface warm from Gunnar's touch and heavy with the accumulated weight of justice long delayed. Around the square, absolute silence reigned. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the assembled clans waited to see what choice she would make. The old laws were clear: blood debt could be claimed with the blade that had been stolen, and no one would question her right to exact vengeance on those who had destroyed her life with their lies. Eric and the other conspirators watched her with the wide eyes of men staring at their own deaths. Some showed resignation, others desperate hope that mercy might still be possible. But it was Gunnar's face that drew her attention most strongly. The man who had courted her under false pretenses, who had made her fall in love with him as part of an elaborate scheme for justice, now stood ready to pay the ultimate price for his family's crimes. 20 years, Sigrid said, her voice carrying across the silent square like the whisper of wind through dry leaves. 20 years I mourned a man I thought died a hero's death. 20 years I shaped my life around grief that was built on lies. She lifted the blade, feeling its perfect balance, remembering how Bjorn used to practice with it in their yard while she watched from the doorway. He had been a skilled swordsman, but gentle by nature, more inclined to settle disputes with words than steel. He would not have wanted his death to lead to more bloodshed, more cycles of vengeance that would poison future generations. The old laws say I have the right to claim blood debt, she continued, turning the sword so its edge caught the afternoon light. To strike down those who murdered my husband and stole 20 years of truth from all of us. Astrid stepped forward, her young face set with determination. Whatever you choose, I stand with you, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. You have been more mother to me in these few days than I have had since my own mother was murdered for seeking truth. The girl's words sent a warm current through Sigrid's heart, reminding her that not everything born from the conspiracy had been evil. Her bond with Astrid was real, forged in shared loss and the courage to face hard truths. Together, perhaps some good could come from even the darkest betrayals. But, Sigrid said, lowering the blade slightly, Bjorn always believed that the strongest warriors were those who knew when not to fight. He would have said that the cycle of blood debt creates more victims than it avenges, that justice should heal rather than wound. She walked slowly toward Eric, the sword still held ready but not threatening. The old man met her gaze with something that might have been gratitude mixed with his fear. Eric Magnusson, she said formally, you confess to the murder of my husband and Valdis Ironwood's daughter. You confess to the conspiracy that followed, the lies that shaped 20 years of false peace. Do you accept responsibility for these crimes? I do, Eric replied, his voice barely audible but steady with resigned dignity. Then you will face judgment according to the clan laws, Sigrid continued. But that judgment will be exile, not death. You and the others involved will leave these lands and never return. Your property will be divided among the families of those you murdered, and your names will be spoken as warnings rather than honored as elders. The sentence was just but merciful, offering punishment without adding more blood to the tally of the dead. Eric's shoulders sagged with relief, while several voices from the crowd called out approval of the wisdom in choosing exile over execution. But it was Gunnar's fate that remained to be decided. He had not participated in the original murders, but his deception of her, his manipulation of her feelings for the sake of justice, was a different kind of betrayal that cut just as deep. Gunnar Thorfinn, she said, turning to face the man she had almost married. You used my grief as a weapon, my desire for love as a tool for investigation. You made me fall for you while planning all along to destroy everything I believed about my life. Yes, he said simply, making no attempt to defend or justify his actions. And yet, Sigrid continued, her voice softening slightly, somewhere in the midst of that deception, something real grew between us. I felt it, and I believe you did too. Gunnar's eyes showed a flicker of hope, quickly suppressed. What I felt doesn't matter. I betrayed your trust in the most fundamental way possible. Sigrid considered this, turning the sword over in her hands one final time before making her decision. With deliberate ceremony, she placed the blade on the truth stone, its steel ringing against granite like a bell marking the end of one age and the beginning of another. "I choose to believe that love can grow even in poisoned soil," she said. "That truth, once spoken, can cleanse the ground where lies once flourished. If you are willing to begin again honestly this time, with no hidden purposes or secret alliances, then perhaps we can build something real from the ashes of deception." The crowd released its held breath in a collective sigh that sounded like wind returning after a storm. Astrid's face lit up with joy, while even Helga seemed satisfied with the wisdom of choosing healing over vengeance. Gunnar stepped forward slowly, his hand extended toward hers. "I would be honored to court you properly this time," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "With truth as our foundation instead of lies." As their hands touched, Sigrid felt the weight of 20 years of false grief finally lifting from her shoulders. The dead had been honored, justice had been served, and the future stretched ahead like an unwritten saga, waiting for new stories to be told. In the distance, Fjara whinnied softly. Her long vigil finally ended. The faithful horse had carried the burden of hidden knowledge for 2 decades, and now she could rest in the peace that comes only when truth has been spoken and justice has been done. The wedding that had been postponed by a horse's stubborn wisdom would happen eventually, but this time it would be built on honesty rather than lies, love rather than manipulation, hope rather than the careful preservation of comfortable deceptions. Some wounds, Sigrid had learned, could indeed heal, but only when the light of truth was allowed to reach them.